Hey, what's up? I'm Sephiros, and today I'm going to be breaking down my track, Sonuf. So, this track I made several versions, and so I'm going to start with the first version so you can see how I kind of started it, and I'll go through some of the main patches and stuff. So let's go. Alright, so here's the first version of my track, Sonuf. So you can see in the first version a lot of stuff is like untitled and a lot of it's this ugly brown color. And there's only like 16 tracks, really. I'm not even using these two, so not a lot of tracks going here. Let's just give a quick listen. So that's the intro, and then this part. So it's pretty basic, just the basic idea. And it's got this kind of intro beats section, and then it goes to a little break, and then this wubby thing, and then I think I just copy pasted it to put a section for another drop, but didn't really change much. So let's go into this first patch. And I think that that's what the track started with. So let's go in here and just check this out. So it'll be cool to see how this patch kind of progressed through the track. So here's the patch. And the whole idea behind this track when I sat down to start it was I wanted to make some sort of dubstep bass that had kind of a free rate so that I could automate it and have some kind of like wonky, not quite synced feeling rhythms to it. So I made this sampler, which is a multi-sampler device where I sampled a sine wave at each note for like several octaves from my modular. So it's like an analog sine wave. And if you look at it, looks like a sine wave, but if you look real close, it's got some irregularity to it. It's got some noise in it. It's got some thickness from being analog. So I wanted it to sound kind of like reminiscent of like a classic wob. So what I did was I used the pitch oscillator tab and I turned the oscillator on to FM mode, frequency modulation. And then let's see, how did I do this? Right, so I turned the volume up to -9 decibels on this modulation oscillator and did the course at 2. So it's playing an octave above the root note. So if I turn this off, and then if I turn it back on, so that's giving it all those mid frequencies. And I got it to wobble by using the LFO here. And I mapped the LFO's frequency, both the LFO's frequency to this macro so that I can control both of them at once. And if we look at the automation, I automated this macro, which is the frequency, and if you look, the rate is set to hertz instead of synced. And I basically just automated these. I automated the macro knob to get the change in the speed of the wobble. And then the LFOs are set to re-trigger so that every time a note hits, the LFO is going to start. And if you look, the phase is offset, and I offset that kind of slightly wonky so that this one, which is the FM wobble, it comes in slightly after the sub. So the sub hits and then the wobble kind of comes in slightly after. And that's set to 90% there. So that's giving it the wobble. And then if you listen, and I'll turn the post-processing off so you can hear kind of what's happening without the post-processing. So it sounds like this without post-processing. So pretty mono. There's no spaciousness. But if you hear, there is some noise layered on top, and that's in this sampler. So this sampler has some random sample of noise in it. If I solo this, I think that might be like a Foley sample of some sort, maybe like a Babbling Brook sample or something like that. And how I got it to sound like that, see how it sounds kind of distorted, like it sounds like the sine wave's distorting it? I'm doing that by using the pitch oscillator tab again in the sampler, and I turned the volume up to -4 dB on this oscillator, and the oscillator's set to 0.5, which is an octave below the root note. And then I'm doing amplitude modulation. So if I turn this off, and then if I turn it back on, it almost sounds like it's playing like a sine wave that's too low to be heard. And that helps it kind of glue with the sub nicely. So that's how I got those to sit together. Also note I high passed it so that there's no sub in the noise. And then I give it some attack so that it comes in a little bit after the note hits. Let's see. I think that's it for the sampler, so let's go to the post-processing. So the post-processing is just some simple trash in parallel. So I have a trash chain with a high pass and a low mids dip, and then nothing on the bottom. So the clean signal is going through the bottom chain, and then the top chain I'm taking the full frequency, including the sub, and I'm putting it into trash and distorting it and doing some filtering. So if that's turned on, so it's giving it a lot of space and a lot more harmonics. So let me show you something about trash. So first of all, you can see that there's some filtering going on. We have some LFOs on these filter cutoffs, and so that's giving it a bit more dynamic movement. So the highs are going up and down. This is going back and forth. This is going back and forth. So that's giving it a bit more of that neuro sound, that kind of like neuro bass. And then the way I got it to sound all messed up and wide is I went into this graph section here and I rearranged the signal flow to put the convolve before the distortion, which is this trash module. So you can reorganize the signal flow however you want in trash, which is really useful. So I wanted to take the wide convolution signal and then distort it along with the sub and all that. So with the convolve, I'm just increasing the width here, and the mix is set pretty high. And I'm using this tape slip, which is in the body tab for the convolutions. and it's set to condenser, and then I'm distorting it with a multiband and just doing some fuzz on the lows, capacity on the mids, which is a drive, and then more fuzz on the top. So altogether it kind of gives a lot of space and a lot of grit and upper harmonics. So that was kind of the main thing that started the idea. And so let's go to a newer version of this track now. And we'll see how it evolved. Alright, so here's the folder for Sonuf. You can see I made a ton of bounces along the way. And I like to render out a lot of renders to hear it outside the studio. I like to listen to it through my Dropbox and just get ideas that way. It's a lot easier for me to know what to do next if I walk away from the studio. So let's skip V2 and let's go straight to version 5. Now, I guess a little side note is I made version 2, 3, 4, and then on V4 phase 3 right here, I rendered out a bunch of stems, but then I decided to change it, so I actually made a V5. And then I also have a version 6 here. And with version 6, I tried some things like a BPM change and stuff that didn't work out, so version 5 is actually the one that ended up being the finished product. So let's check that out now. I'm going to open up version 5. So this version 5, this is almost a month later after I did that first version. And I'll show you a little bit about how it evolved. We might have to open up version 4 because I think version 5 has flattened out a lot of stuff. Freezed and flattened stuff. This might take a minute. Yeah, this track was a lot of fun to make. But it definitely took a little while. It took me maybe about a month to produce the whole thing. I hope this opens soon. It's taking forever. Alright, here we go. I think it's going to work. Come on. Open up, Ableton. I don't know why, but Ableton 11's taken a lot longer to open than I've experienced with earlier versions. All right, so here we go. Uh-oh. It might be too CPU intense. Come on. Okay, so here we go. Oh yeah, it's really slow. Let's see if I can play this. Come on now, Ableton. So here is the project. It looks a lot bigger than it did before, right? So I'll give you a little sample of what it sounds like now. Skip ahead. I'll skip to the next drop. And then the switch up sounds like... Cool, so if you want to hear the whole track, just go stream it. So let's open it up and let's go through the bass now. So we'll start with the first bass and let's see if the patch is open for the second bass. See, I have, this meanie bass right here. I still have the patch, so we can go through that. But let's first go back into this deep wub bass and listen to it. So if you can tell I added a lot more plugins. So let's go through what's happening. So same noise, same sine wave for the fundamental sound. And then I'll go through this post-processing and turn it off. And then turn it on one by one. So first you can see I have two envelope followers, and those are following the contour. So you can see they're following the contour, and then they're mapped to this channel up here, which has some noise on it. So before, and then if I solo both of these together, so what's happening here is I felt like it needed some more width in the highs and some more noise. And so I added this rack with this new channel up here, which is more noise. It's some random Foley sample, probably some babbling brook or something. Let's see. Let's listen to it. It's high passed, so if we low pass it. Okay, so that's actually, that's some like granular resampling that I did later on. So that's probably the track sent through a bunch of glitch plugins and then stretched out more. But I thought it had some good width and texture to it. So I added this rack, which is basically a utility with the gain mapped to a macro, and then the kilohertz comb filter set to stereo and mixed in 50%, and that give it more width. So before and then after. So it almost sounds like it's inside a can or a small tunnel, like a culvert or something. Metallic kind of space to it. And then I have the cutoff of this comb filter mapped to the same macro here, and then I'm using the envelope follower to use the wobble amplitude modulation to make this kind of wobble along with it so that it creates a layer that fits together nicely. So let's keep going. So with the trash, turn it on. So what's happening here with the trash is I have a dry chain, and now I have low passed the sound so that it's just the low mids and the sub. And then I have sitting on top a trash rack that has two parallel trashes that are mixed into as different amounts. And I guess this top one has two trashes. So the first trash is the original trash, that I showed you in the last project. And then I added another trash after it. That has some different algorithms and no convolution and no filtering, just giving it a bit more grit. And then another trash in parallel to that one that is distorting the signal again with a different convolution, doing the same thing where the convolve is before the trash. So that's adding a bit more highs and similar filtering and similar distortion settings to this first one. So I basically just duplicated that first one and changed the convolution impulse to give it a bit more texture. And then again, EQing out the sub so that the sub comes through clean on this bottom channel. And you can see I'm doing some mid-side EQ here. I'm boosting the sides between like, what is this? Like between like 1K and 4, 5, 6, like I guess 1K to 7K, boosting it and then cutting it out of the mids to kind of focus the bass a bit more. And then you can see I've actually boosted here a little bit just to get that nice low mid tone. So some surgical EQing. And then the next thing we have here is a utility, which is doing nothing. I like to have utilities just in case I want to automate the volume down. And then we have a Fab Filter Pro-Q. And if I look at the automation on this, this is the filter that I'm using to bring it in. So I'm introducing it here. So that's kind of being used as a kind of a far away filter. And then we have M Wave Shaper. So before M Wave Shaper, let's go to this part. So I'm basically just kind of turning down the stuff that's below 30 dB to give it a bit more dynamic, kind of increasing the dynamic there. And then I'm boosting it just very slightly and then clipping it off. So I'm basically pushing everything below, what is this, 3 dB? I'm like basically pushing it 3 dB into the clipping. And that's just mixed in 20%. So just giving it a slight bit more crunch and volume. And then I'm putting it through Decapitator. So before Decapitator, it sounds like this. So the Decapitator is giving it a lot more grit, and I'm basically keeping the mix high and the drive low and using this middle algorithm, which is, I believe, a Neve analog model, and just turned down the brightness a bit so that the distortion is focused more in the lower mids. So giving it more bite in the lows with that Decapitator. And then that's going through this SSQ, which is an analog modeled EQ based on the rack mount SSL EQ. So before, it sounds like this. And then after. So basically what I'm doing is I'm boosting the sub here below like 150 and then cutting a little bell out of somewhere between around 200 hertz, 300 hertz. And then I'm boosting at 3K, and then not doing anything to the highs. So just kind of balancing the spectrum to have more sub and a bit more clarity in the low mids. And then I have this other rack, which is a momentary rack. So if I show the automation here, this automation only comes in later during these fill sections. So that little riser that's going, that's being created by this frequency shifter. And I'm automating the frequency shifter to do a little bit of a riser. So I basically just, it's like a built-in riser. And then after the frequency shifter, I put the phaser flanger and automated the output of it so that basically the volume wobbles along with it while it's rising up. And that's just a momentary effect. And then I have the dry chain here, just letting the signal go through. Then I have a Fab Filter Pro-Q 3, boosting the sub more and dipping the low mids more and boosting the highs more, and then cutting the super highs just a little bit with a shelf. And then I have this rack, which is pretty interesting. So if we go back here, so after all this processing, I thought it wasn't really pumping enough. So what I did was I duplicated this envelope follower and then decided to use another one to map to a utility later on in the chain. So I mapped it to this utility that's after all that processing, and that's almost like a sidechained gate. So it's actually making the dynamic more, it's making the bass more dynamic. So if I turn it on and off, so it's just set to 10 dB, so minus 10 dB to 0 on the mapping. So it's just kind of, it's almost like a compressor. It's kind of like a sidechain compressor, but inverted. Then I have another SSQ, which is boosting the low mid frequencies again, and boosting the upper middle frequencies and turning down the highs a bit, so just balancing out the EQ even more. And this EQ, it introduces a bit of nonlinearity and warmth. So I had cut it here with this EQ, and then I'm kind of boosting it back up with this EQ, and that gives it a little bit more warmth. And then I have at the end of the chain, well, we're almost there. So then I put the reverb, which is a side-chained reverb, and I'm just using Fab Filter Pro C with the sidechain set. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe it defaulted itself back. It's supposed to be set to external. Yeah, so that was supposed to be set to external sidechain, and then it's basically just ducking the reverb out of the way of the bass and then having it come in after the bass. So that keeps the bass clean but gives it a sense of being huge or in a huge space. And that's just put in parallel with the dry chain and EQ'd so that the reverb isn't too intense in the highs and is mostly focused in the mids. Then I have another EQ that's basically just surgical balancing the final EQ touches for this sound. and then a clipper to catch any peaks that might happen. I'm actually driving that whole thing into the clipper about 3 dB. So it's clipping the signal and leveling it. So it's kind of like using a limiter but without the limiting artifacts, and it's just adding some subtle saturation to the end of the chain. And then another utility, and this end of chain utility I'm just using right here to cut to silence because the tail was ringing through, so I needed that to be silent right there. So that's that whole sound. Pretty happy with that sound. You may notice that there is this other sound that comes in every so often right here. It's this sound. And that is that same patch duplicated. And I had just duplicated that patch and changed the trash presets to make it kind of more bitey and less deep and more gritty. And it has some M wave shaper like the last one. And then it also has some wave shaper multiband where I'm really pushing those highs and those upper mids and then kind of decreasing the lower volumes of the lower mids and pushing the higher volumes of the lower mids. And that M wave shaper is really what gave it that final bit of crunch. And then obviously to get a little more crunch, I had put it through the saturator, and similar thing with the Pro-Q where I'm boosting the sub a bit and dipping out the low mids and then boosting those highs. So getting that sound to sound nice and bright and full but not too muddy. And then obviously just boosting it a bit into the saturator to clip it off. And then I have this other sound here, which I called meanie bass. So I guess I could do a little side note on arrangement here. The arrangement is basically broken into 3 different types of sections. You have this beats section, which I think of as kind of like, I think of this beats section as kind of like foreplay or like getting you in the mood. And then a little bit of a build into this kind of deeper dubstep-y kind of influenced section, which has like a rim shot, so different snare. And then we have this more aggressive drop. So basically it's increasing in energy. So it starts kind of in ambient world, then goes to this kind of beats world, then it goes to this kind of deep dubstep minimalish world. Then it goes to a little ambience again, and then to this more aggressive drop that is a bit longer as well. And then it returns at the end to the deep dubstep thingy again. And then it finally comes down to another kind of sort of beats ambient section. So I have this main bass here, which is that more aggressive bass with a lot of highs. So much more aggressive, sounds very alive and monstrous. And I tease this bass in this first section. So in this first section, it just comes in twice as kind of a fill. So you're used to this bass, which is the deep bass. So yeah, I don't know if this is actually the final version of the track, but it sounds, let me listen to this last bit real quick. Yeah, it's not quite the final version, but let's go through this mini bass real quick, and then we'll go to the final version of the track. So where is it? Here it is. So you can see I've bounced it to save CPU because my computer was starting to freak out. And so we can turn this chain back on and go through all of this stuff. So I'm going to hit Command A and then 0 to turn everything back on. And then I'm actually going to just select all this post-processing and turn it off so you can kind of hear it turned on one at a time like we did with the last one. So here we have the bass without any post-processing. So pretty cool bass. It's made up of a couple layers. So it has the sub layer and the noise layer in common with that deep dubstep or that more wobbly dubstep bass. And so what I did was I had duplicated that patch and then decided to make a new bass. And I decided to make this bass. So without the phase plant, it sounds like this. So no more wobbling going on. It's basically a strong note and a noise layer. And then I added this mid bass, which sounds like this on its own. So that's doing a lot of the work, and it doesn't have any sub, it's just all mids. So if we look here, I basically have two wavetables, and the wavetable here on the bottom is below the output for the chain, which means that you can't actually hear this wavetable, and it is doing phase modulation to the sine wave oscillator here on the top. And then I'm basically using random modulators to modulate the wavetable position of this FM operator and the wavetable position of this audible oscillator. And then the unison is set to 4 smooth with a bit of detune and spread. So it's very wide. And that's about it. I think, yeah, this note plugin right here is modulating the filter cutoff to follow along with whatever note is played to make sure that the sub is always gone. So I'm cutting out the fundamental and then a bit of slice EQ just to tame those low mids. So pretty simple sound, but those random modulators, they ensure that the sound is kind of always morphing. And this one right here is controlling the amount of FM. So I'm controlling the amount of FM and both the wavetables. So it's getting more and less FM'd as the wavetables are morphing. So it's never quite the same twice, but it's always just kind of morphing and creating that nice mid character. And so that's layered up with the sub and the noise. And then it goes through a similar chain. So it's going through trash with a parallel chain that has the highs EQ'd out. So it's just clean sub. And then on the top here, we have a trash. So before the trash, we'll loop up a bit of this. So before this chain, it sounds like this. And then after the chain, it sounds like this. So it's adding a lot of noise to the signal and kind of almost making it sound thinner in a way and more messed up. And I'm basically doing a similar thing with the convolution, where the convolution is before the trash, and I'm using scissors in the tone section, boosting the width and mixing it in and distorting that along with the sub and everything. And I'm doing some pretty intense wave shaping here and double stages, more intense wave shaping using distort, dense, and then right here I'm using some fuzz, boosting the drive quite a bit on both of them, but actually taking the pre down on this one. And then I'm just mixing that in a bit. So mixing in some more distortion with that dry signal. Then it's going through a ladder filter here, which is just an analog modeled filter with some resonance set to the transistor mode, and then some mid-side EQ where I'm controlling the low mids here, cutting the sub out, and cutting the sides a bit higher, around 300 or around 200, 2 to 300, and then cutting the sides up high. So focusing the width more in these upper mids and ensuring that the top is a little bit more mono compatible and less overwhelming. So the ladder filter here, I'm just using as a momentary effect. So if I open this up, we'll see where I'm using it. So I bring in the ladder filter for this second section. And in the mix, it sounds like this. So that part actually did not make it into the final version. I decided to make a new bass for that switch up. So that's not really very important. I could even just delete that out of this patch. That didn't make it in the final patch. So next here we have some EQ, and this EQ is being used as like a far away thing. So right here I'm introducing it in the intro. So that kind of just comes in, just very, very subtle in the intro. And then Wave Shaper Multiband. So Multiband Wave Shaper, I'm basically doing this similar thing where I'm taking the really quieter bits of the highs and just really boosting those without boosting much of the louder parts of the signal. And I'm doing that in a more subtle way here on the mids. And then the lows are getting boosted overall just very slightly. And those are fully wet, and that's giving it that finishing crunch, that finishing bite on the top end. And then a utility, which I'm using as a mute right here for that fill. And so pretty simple sound. Oh, you can see that I'm using the automation here for something. Not quite sure what that is. I think I'm not sure what that is. But yeah, just some automation there, but pretty simple sound. And what's really doing most of the work is just that random modulation in the source. Cool, so that's that bass. I ended up bouncing it out. And we can talk about this bass. So what's happening here is I have a sub in phase plant, which basically just has an envelope on the volume, and it's just a sine wave, clean sine wave. So on its own, it sounds like this. And then I have it in a group with these chords. So those chords are basically being used as a top bass. So what I've done is EQ'd the lows out of them, put them through some amp, mixed in with some amp to give it more highs and more presence. And then I'm going through an M convolution multiband with no algorithm on the lows, and then a very small, oh, actually pretty big reverb on the top. And this is a church convolution. And then I'm sending that through this auto pan, and I am modulating the rate and the amount of this auto pan, and it's basically the around the head preset set to spin, and I'm automating the rate and the amount. So this is kind of spinning around your head. So giving a bit more space to the whole thing. And I am then crushing both of those together with a trash and doing what's called intermodulation distortion. So with this trash, which is set to fuzz garage and just with a bit of drive and mixed in, it's going to make those highs of this sound like they're amplitude modulated by the sub, and it's going to kind of make them almost duck out a bit, like almost like they're sidechained away. And then right here, I wanted to give a bit of a switch up and just do a little hint of rhythm. So I made this bass. And this bass is actually pretty simple. It sounds like this on its own. Basically just a quarter note wobble, and I'm wobbling the volume of the sub, and then I have a top oscillator, which is basically just a saw wave that's being modulated. So I'm kind of modulating the wavetable position and then using a high pass with the Q cranked all the way and doing some FM to that wavetable as well from this wavetable. And then what's giving it that squelchy character is I'm sending that boosted Q right into this distortion, which is on the foldback. So that Q smashes into the distortion and gets squared off and creates all these cool kind of acid harmonics. And I'm sending it into the distortion with the sub, so there's actually some intermodulation distortion happening where the sub is pushing this top oscillator out of the way as it hits this distortion. And then that is doing the same thing going through the clipper along with the other thing. And then what is this layer doing? So that's just a little bit more chord stuff. So pretty simple right there. That's pretty much all the basses. It's pretty much just 3 basses. I think that there's a couple basses in this intro that I could maybe talk about. Yeah, these. So this sounds like this. So that's basically that same deep dubstep patch without any FM, and it's got that same noise oscillator on top. This one is basically an operator which I think is off. So I was just using this operator to get everything in tune. This is a Mr. Carmack 808, and the 808 is going through some similar trash with this cool plug-in echo bode. So without the trash, it sounds like this, just a sub. And then with the echo bode and the trash, it sounds like this. So without the echo bode and the convolution reverb, it sounds like this. And I'm basically just modulating the separation on the convolve right here. So that's giving it that really super wide effect. And again, the convolution's before the distortion. And the distortion here, I'm doing cheap digital. And then I have set the wave shaping to like this quantized thing. So that's what's giving it that super digital kind of bit reduction-y sound. And then I'm sending that through this echo bode. And that's where that little effects tail is coming from. This is a really cool delay that has a frequency shifter built in. And it also is kind of like a reverb because it has this smear function. So next I have put it through Convolution Reverb. Again, M convolution. This time I'm using the easy and it's on a medium room. So that's giving it a bit of room, just mixing that in, high passing it so that there's no super low sub in the reverb. And that's just giving it a bit more space. So that sounds like. And then again, taming those low mids, boosting those highs with EQ, and mixing it in -4 dB with the sub. So that's that bass. Then we have this bass, which is pretty cool. So here's a cool little tip for arrangement is like contrast. So I wanted to make something that contrasted. So this bass is very sustained and kind of digital sounding. So I thought something that would contrast to that a lot would be like some sort of rhythm dubstep kind of wobble. So that's where this idea came from. And those both contrast nicely with this bass because this bass doesn't have a lot of highs. I'm sorry, it doesn't have a lot of mids. It has a lot of highs from that noise. So this is kind of a little fill bass. And this bass is phase plant. Got some 2 LFOs doing basically the same speed wobble, just at slightly different settings. And then the third one, and this third one is going slow and it's on retrigger. So when that note retriggers, it sends the sound on a longer journey. And this is mapped to a bunch of things like the frame of several things. The LFOs here are modulating the amount of frequency modulation or phase modulation that's happening. And then I have a clean sub. And those are being sent to different groups. So I'm sending the sub layer to lane 2. And then this top bass layer is being sent to lane 1. And here I'm also wobbling the high pass in a traditional rhythm style. And then I'm also doing a modulated notch, which is kind of like a throat opening and closing. So that's what gives it that really vocal character. And then there's some cool spatialization. Same thing again with the trash. Same thing with the convolution. Here I'm doing more of that digital, so I probably just duplicated. Yeah, I duplicated this patch and then made this patch. So a lot of duplication and changing in my process. I'm sending it through spectral time, and that's what's giving it that crazy space sound. So that I'm just modulating some of these parameters, the shift, time, tilt, and spray, and that's fully wet. So the trash is getting very much spectralized. And then also letting the dry signal through here without any EQ. So without that layer of trash, it sounds like this. totally dry. And then with that space layer, it sounds like this. So giving a lot more dimension. Then here it comes back again. But I also layer it up with this lead. Here in this lead, I'm using a plugin that I use all the time. It's called Crystallizer, and it's a grain delay. And modulating the mix. So the mix comes in at the end of the phrase here. And that's basically a throw. So I'm throwing the crystallizer, so using this lead also as an effect, making like a splash effect. And this is just a simple FM patch. Let's see what's happening here. Yeah, so just kind of an unsynced LFO here that's just wobbling along, kind of randomly controlling some stuff. And then this wobble, which is controlling the level of this noise oscillator. So a little bit of FM from noise, a little bit of FM from this non-audible wavetable. So one audible wavetable, and then this one's non-audible. So that's a cool little like splashy effect that comes in and out every once in a while. I think those are all the main patches. I don't think I'm missing anything. I guess there's this melodies group where we have things like this. Yeah, that's pretty cool. So here I have the phase plant, and the phase plant is doing kind of a plucky, there's like a plucky patch, basically a sine wave going through multiple stages of folding distortion, fold back sine and more fold back, modulating the drive. That gives it a really physical transient, and then just a bunch of plucky envelopes using velocity to control the gain, so it's kind of velocity sensitive. Sending it through these spectral resonator. So without the spectral resonator, let's select all this post-processing and turn it off. So without this spectral resonator, it sounds like this. So a lot of panning stuff happening, and that's coming from the unison here. And then with the spectral resonator, giving it a bunch of high end. This is almost acting as a reverb on the granular mode with the rate set, mod rate set pretty high, and the stretch all the way up. It gives it this kind of weird character. Then we can go into this, which is a side-chained delay rack with a dry chain. So I'm setting the dry through dry. And then with this, I have Crystallizer doing a shimmer, which is when you set the pitch 12 cents or something up. So it's an octave above, so that's giving it that shimmer. And then that's being sidechained by Shaperbox. So I didn't really need to do that because Crystallizer actually has a built-in ducker right here where you can set the attack and release. So that's kind of not the smartest way of approaching that, but that's what I did. And then obviously just EQ'd the shimmer so that it would be in the back. So I low passed it and high passed it. So it's kind of pushing it back in the mix as a background stereo ambience. And then just using a Pro-Q again to bring stuff in and out. So when it comes in, it's being band passed in. So that's kind of the main little like string lead, and then we have this pad here. which I think is just some random sample, probably like a Rhodes, maybe it's like some sort of hip hop sample, and just EQing it. A bit of chorus. This is the Juno Chorus. It's a really nice sounding chorus by Arturia. And again, using the opening bandpass method to bring it in and out. A little bit of automated gain, super simple sound. This high pad, which is the same pad duplicated and I think just pitched up. Yeah, so I just pitched it up, put a big reverb on it, EQ'd it. So you can get a lot of mileage out of sounds if you just keep duplicating them. We have some of this stuff in the intro. Just kind of an ominous pad. Here we have this, which is like a fifth. So those two together make kind of a chord. Kind of an ominous chord. That's the same pad, just put through some pedal. And this is by Analog Obsession, just an analog modeled guitar pedal plugin with 5 different models that you can choose from, and that's in parallel with the dry, mixed in, and then putting through reverb, so that gives it kind of a gritty texture. We didn't talk about the effects at all. I think that's all the melodies. Let's see, are there any other melodies? Yeah, so this is that same phase plant plucky patch, just played an octave higher and a little bit different settings on the spectral resonator. Same thing, just duplicated the patch, changed it slightly. And yeah, very minimal on the melodies in this track. There's not a lot of melodies in this track. It's mostly supposed to be about the bass. I think I went through all the basses too. What is this? Oh, right. So this is a very important element. It's the vocal chop. And so I'll solo the vocal chop here. So how I made that vocal chop was I created this group, so I can turn this group on, and then we'll save this post-processing. So right here, I have the vocal chop, which is in a sampler. So if I solo that, it sounds like this. Wait, sounds like this. And then has an EQ on it. And with this EQ, I just wanted to boost those highs and get it out of the way of the bass because it has to fit with the bass. And then here I have a plugin called Track Spacer, which is a multi-band sidechaining plugin. And I have the input for the sidechain coming from the deep dub or the deep wub here. So basically I'm using this plugin to sidechain the vocal chop out of the way of that deep dub wub to keep that low end tight and clean and give everything a pump feel. So the way I'm getting that vocal chop sound is basically just a couple MIDI notes and then some pitch bending to make it sound like a record that's being scratched. So that's kind of just a little scratch. I was going for like that record scratch vibe. And then there's this, which is another vocal chop that I didn't actually end up using. So that was useless. And then I just basically sent it through some vintage verb and automated the mix. So this is just a pre and post EQ with a reverb in the middle, macroed up the decay, and mapped this other macro called verb to the chain volume. So this I'm just using to bring the reverb in and out and doing some automated reverb over the course of the section. So that's how I get it to come out of the distance. And then we have little altar boy here. And that comes in later on, I think. Yeah, at the end, I bring in this little altar boy, and this is basically being used to do performance shifting. So I shifted the formants down so that it wouldn't sound so chipmunky when I pitched the chop up later in this section right here. So it's pitched up, but it doesn't sound overly chipmunky, which is from the little altar boy. So if I turn this off, it's Alvin the Chipmunk. So that helped me avoid the chipmunk, and then just crushed it with some amp, blended it in to give it a little bit more grit, and resampled the whole group so that I didn't have to use the processing, and so I could do more manual chops. And if you look here, I have gone and done a bit of chopping, did a little bit of reversing, and have some automated stuff right here. So add line for each automated envelope. So right here, it's pretty much clean. Just again, using the around the head preset, but set to spin, and then automating the amount later on. So to step it up a level from here to here, I added this automation here, and also I think automating this, which is a it's like a frequency shifting delay. I think it's even free. Valhalla. What's up, Quantopics? Yeah, so right here, just modulating this echo and the auto pan. So in context, I'm kind of using it as a riser here, and then it comes in and does its choppy thing. All right, so basically that's all the stuff. I didn't talk about the effects, so we could maybe talk about the effects. We have several types of effects. We have like impacts and little splashes and little reverses and stuff. So if I go through some of these, we can start at the top here. Yeah, let's start here. This is like a riser. And I made that by basically bouncing out this main bass here. So I bounced this out. So I bounced that out because I wanted to tease the timbre of it in the intro. So that's what this is. So it's kind of introducing you to the fact that there are wobbles and that kind of texture. Then I have this, which is some metallic Foley going through some modulated grain delay. Here I'm just modulating the dry, wet, random pitch amount, and spray with random LFOs, and EQing out the lows, and EQing out the lows way more before the delay. So that comes in periodically as splashes as well. And I bring that in periodically to give some emphasis. We have another layer of it, which is dry. And I actually made this before. I think that was the first thing I made in the whole track, was I just put some metallic Foley samples in granulator and stretched them out. Here is some sort of riser. I think I made that by just like putting a Foley sample through a bunch of reverb, bouncing it, and then reversing it. This. Yeah, I think I made all this by just putting random Foley samples in granulator and then resampling the output. This. It's an impact sample that I've put through reverb, EQ'd the sub out twice before and after the reverb, and it's fully wet on the reverb. Big concert hall reverb. And I bring that in periodically to add emphasis to sections. So like right here. So yeah, that's that. I made this later on. This is a bounce of the sample. So it's like very distorted vocal chop. And I made this by recording myself saying "ka" a bunch of times in my room. So it's actually a ton of samples, and they're all slightly different, and then they're panned right and left. So it sounds like this. I think that's on a drum hit, so you can't hear it. Let's see. Yeah. So it's very wide. Put it through some reverb, Valhalla plate, and then distorted the reverb along with the dry. Very intense, and then EQ'd. Or I guess I didn't even EQ it. So yeah, I just bounced that out and used it once right here. So it sounds like this in context. I guess I should talk about this little section here. This is kind of cool. So I switched up the flow a little bit in the final version, which I'll go to next, but the idea here was to give a break from everything and make everything get sound like it broke, kind of like sounds like a shitty tape or something. And so if you look, I have this sidechained group and this drums group, and then all of that is in this pre-pre group, and then I have a pre-group. So if I close the pre-pre group, you can see there's only one thing outside of the pre-pre group, and that only happens at this point, and that is a cymatic sample of tape noise. So that really helps this section, and then basically what I did here to achieve that filtering out effect is a bunch of automation. So on the group that has everything in it, including the drums, I have these things that I turn on just for this moment. And it's basically an EQ, which I use to filter. If I solo this. So basically, just a closing bandpass filter. I'm also automating a utility to turn it down, automating an amp. So the amp comes in. So the amp automation here is very subtle, but it comes in at the end to give it a little push. Then automating some convolution reverb here. So right here. I don't know why it's cutting out there. It shouldn't be. Then I'm using this SP950, which is set to mono sum, and automating the mix amount and the tune. So the tune is this bit rate. So turning down the bit rate gives it that downsampled sound, and then mixing it in makes everything get more mono. So everything kind of gets mono at this point. And then I just have a clipper on the group that's always on, and that's just to catch any peaks from summing. So I think that is everything. The cymatic sound is outside of all that filtering, so that gives it this interesting effect. So that makes everything sound super wide when it comes back in, because you're like, you get used to this little mono spot just for a second, and then it gets all crazy and wide again. So I'm super proud of that transition. I really like it. Yeah. So 76 tracks in this project. So let's go to the final version. Ooh, here's a drop that didn't make it in. This is the old switch up, I think. Never mind, that's like a cooldown section that didn't actually make it into the final. So let's close this now and open the final version. So after I got to this point, I said, okay, I'm going to do a save as and start bouncing stuff to audio and summing stuff through my Electron Analog Heat, which is an analog outboard saturator unit. God, why is it taking so long to close? Okay, let's go to the final version here. So I think, let's see, the final version is 5. Yeah, version 5 stems, I think, is the final version. I have version 6.1 and 0.2, but those I didn't actually end up finishing. I might at some point make those into like a VIP or something. How's your day going, Quantopics? Thanks for tuning in. All right. So here is the final version of Sonuf. Here you can see I've pared it down to way less tracks and complexified some things. So let's go through what's happening here. So basically I sent all my groups, the bass group, the melodic group, and the effects group. I sent each group through my analog saturation unit and resampled the output in real time. I don't know why the audio's here. There we go. So I resampled my groups. I summed them with varying levels of saturation. So that was really nice to get everything into one stem. And so it sounds like this. You can see some things that aren't bass made it into this stem because it sounds good to saturate things along with bass. So I liked the way this little splashy lead sounded going through the analog distortion along with the bass. So the basses, they sound pretty much the same. They're just warmed up and given that final level of crunch. So I drove it fairly hard through the analog distortion and just the same setting on all of it. Did the same thing to varying degrees on the melodic stem. You can hear a lot of the analog saturation there in the intro. So yeah, that really just warmed everything up nicely. And then to mix it, well, I had the mix sounding pretty good before I did that summing, and then this final mix is just to get it really loud. So this is kind of like the mastering project. And here I basically have some final EQ, mid-side EQ, where I'm turning down the mid a little bit. I decided to go kind of less on the sub, just because I know a lot of clubs and a lot of headphone companies like to boost the sub. So I actually opted for a lower sub level than I wanted on my own system, just to make everything translate nice. And then doing this mid-side EQ to clean up the sides, make sure there's no side information in the sub, and then going through a super clean clipper to get everything extra loud. And I think this project topped out at 3 LUFS or 4 LUFS across the loudest drop, so it's super loud. But I think it still sounds pretty clean and dynamic considering. So this clipper is a big reason of why that is. This clipper has this little detail preservation function, and I'm not sure quite how this works. Preserves spectral detail using usually lost during clipping. So that's really cool. It's just a really clean clipper. I'm using it on soft clip here on the basses. Oh, and then going through Pro L, and the Pro L is on transparent and just doing a little bit of limiting on the bass. So just very subtle, -1 dB of gain reduction on the limiter, so you're not getting any weird pumping from the limiter. It's just getting it that little bit more loud. Same thing on the melodies group, just no limiter. Taking a little bit more of the low mids out because it needed that. When you saturate everything, a lot of times that makes more stuff pile up in the low mids. So that's why there's so many EQs in the project where I'm repeatedly cleaning things up, because it's usually after I've applied more distortion. Same thing with the clipper, just driving it a bit into the clipper. So same thing with the effects stem, again, driving it a little bit into the clipper, getting the levels of these three groups right against the drums. And originally, I had bounced the drums through my analog saturation as well, and that's what this is. But I just couldn't get it sounding right. It sounds like this. So I just could not get it sounding right. So I decided to go with the clean drum rack instead. So this is my drum rack. So at this point, I was listening to it repeatedly through the mastering limiter, which I have up here. So I'd bounce something out and then master it and listen to it. And then I ended up putting the master right here on this pre group. I also have insight on here, so I was kind of checking the LUFS and the spectrum and just getting the loudest possible mix I could without my kick falling apart. And that was actually quite a battle for this first section. You can see I'm doing some stuff here in the master. So I was able to get the master sounding good without having to use this transient shaping, but I am driving it into a clipper once again after the limiting. So that's what's really cool about Newfangled Audio Elevate, is it has this final clipper, and that's what's giving that final bit of grit and loudness that I think sounds really good on this track. The speed is set with the adaptive speed 50% up, so that means that the speed of the limiter is actually going to auto adjust depending on what kind of transients are coming in. So it's not like you have to settle for one speed of attack and release. And same thing with the gain. The adaptive gain is set to 6 decibels. So within a 6 decibel range, this gain is going to automatically adjust depending on how loud things are going into it. So it's a really intelligent mastering plugin. I'm not doing anything with the filter bank, but you can see here with the limiter EQ, you can choose per band how much limiting you want. So how loud you want the signal to go into the limiter, and I actually turned down the highs just a slight bit. And if I were to redo this track and master it again, I would probably do a little bit more here. Like I would probably turn it down just a slight bit more in the highs, because the highs did come out quite intense. And I actually, at the end of the whole process, decided to make a new kick drum for this section because I couldn't get this old kick drum to work. The old kick drum I used here. So for that more aggressive drop, I decided to stick with this kick that I made in Phase Plant, which is basically like a clipped sine wave wavetable that I'm modulating. And it's just a basic kick patch with a little bit of FM going on. So FMing the kick slightly, And then it has this noise patch that is amplitude modulated by a square wave, so it gives it a little bit of a rattle on the top end. And I actually have that band passed into just the mids, so it's giving a little bit of rattle grit to the mids. Super aggressive kick, but it didn't work for this section. So for this section, I decided to make a deep kick, and I made that by stacking a little percussion crunch with a very clean kick 2, and the kick 2 is just very little transient because the transient's coming from that Foley sample, and then it's very short and punchy and thuddy and round, and just putting it through a bit of decapitator, and that seemed to work really nicely. I'm sending all the drum bus through a parallel chain of analog modeled saturation coming from this tube model by Analog Obsession. I probably should have turned on oversampling. And it's just set to model 4 and driving it really hard and then turning the output down and then just mixing that in minus 10 dB and EQing out the sub and mids. So that's giving it a little bit more crunch and analog saturation on the whole drum kit. I have this momentary effect right here that just comes in at the end. It's just like a dub out delay. And then I have the same clipper here where I'm just clipping everything with kind of a harder clip. No detail preservation because I wanted that little bit of saturation, and that's just cutting off the tops. So just doing about a dB of clipping there. And then I'm taking all these stems and summing them together through the sidechained group. And how I got the sidechain sounding so tight is a special trick where I duplicated the drum rack that holds my sidechain triggers. I'm using MIDI triggered sidechaining with Shaperbox. And I duplicated them and put them in this new rack. And this new rack is just a drum rack that holds only external instruments, which are sending the MIDI to this sidechain group that has several different duckers. It has one ducker that is longer and one that is a bit shorter. And the shorter one is being triggered by my snare and the littler kicks, and the longer one is being triggered by the big aggressive kick. But I have nudged the triggers early. So if you look here, the triggers are happening um, 20 milliseconds, I think. About 20 milliseconds before every drum hit. So the sidechain is actually getting triggered before the drum gets triggered itself, which gives it that really clean, extra perfect duck. So to kind of show you what I mean here, I'll exaggerate it. So here's the mix with it sounding like it is. So you can see when I move it earlier, you can tell what it's doing. But it sounded really good right here, and I took a bit of time to just get that sounding really in the pocket. So that's all sounding good together. here on the sidechained group, I have these turned off. I was trying to push it loud with more clipping and more limiting. I'm not sure if I ended up actually using these or not. I can't remember. I think I did, but I might not have needed it. That's probably why they're off. And then on the pre channel, I have all those effects that I used for that one moment right over here. And if you do your final mix and mastering, or if you're using another mastering engineer, if you just do your final mix this way, also it makes it a lot easier to kind of do little chops and edits. So I did quite a few little audio edits and chops and little mutes and stuff once I had the stems cleared up like that. And then the final thing on the chain is Newfangled Saturate, doing a 3 dB boost, so clipping everything a bit more. Whenever you sum things together, you get odd peaks that stick up above everything else, and that's why multiple stages of clipping is the way to go when you're trying to get things loud and clean. Limiting introduces a lot of weird pumping artifacts if you push it really hard, and oftentimes clipping is actually going to be cleaner, especially if you use a clipper that's intelligent like this one. I didn't actually use the detail preservation on the pre-master here because I liked the way the saturation was sounding. But you can always turn that on if you don't like the way the saturation is sounding. So that just gives everything a little bit more fullness. And then the end of chain is just Newfangled Elevate, which is the limiter / clipper that I used. And yeah, that's the track. So I think that's everything. And yeah, I think that was a pretty thorough breakdown of all the sounds. Yeah, I don't think I missed anything. I hope you enjoyed that. If you haven't heard the song yet, check it out on streaming. It's called Sonuf, Sonuf, under the name Sephiros, 5EPHR05. I really appreciate you watching, and hit that like and subscribe. This will be up on YouTube, and yeah, check it out. And if you want the stems, I provided the stems on my Patreon. It's just like I think $6 a month, and there's like thousands of samples on there for you to download, tons of samples from the Euro Rack, and the stems are up there, and some racks and other goodies. So if you want some cool production assets, check that out. And I also offer lessons if you want to go even more in depth on anything or get feedback on your tunes. Let me know if you want that. So yeah, go check that out at Patreon at Sephiros, 5EPHRO5. Same name on all socials and everything. And until next time, yeah, I'm Sephiros. Thanks for watching. Big up.